She was just waiting for her son to come home for dinner in her quiet house when a police officer burst through the door. Instead of protecting her, he humiliated her and hit her right in her own home. But he didn't know whose mother she was or what it meant to anger her son, Chuck Norris. The consequences were a shock to everyone. Subscribe and write where you are watching this video from. The evening had settled like a warm blanket over the old one-story house on the edge of town. Outside, the rain was falling steadily, the drops tapping against the roof and trickling in silver streams down the windows. The sound was constant, soothing even, as though the sky had decided it was time to wash the streets clean. The porch light glowed dimly in the haze, illuminating the outline of a stubborn rose bush that clung to life no matter the season. Inside, however, the world felt safe. The kitchen smelled of roasted chicken and thyme, steam rising gently from the oven. The light above the table was golden, soft, casting a circle of warmth on the polished wood and the photographs in their frames that lined the nearby walls. Mrs. Norris moved quietly from counter to stove, adjusting a pan here, wiping a spill there, humming softly under her breath. She was not a fragile woman, though age had drawn lines upon her face and silver into her hair. Her eyes still held clarity, the sharpness of one who had lived long and seen much. To her, the evening had promised nothing but calm. She had looked forward to this night for days, knowing her son would stop by. It had been some time since she had seen him properly. He was always moving, always busy, whether training, working, or traveling. But tonight he had promised he would come by after his day's obligations, and she had prepared dinner with the kind of care that mothers reserve for their children, no matter how grown they became. The house reflected his life in many ways. Photographs told the story of a boy who had once been small and serious, then a young man with determination burning in his eyes, and finally the man who had become known far beyond the borders of their little town. There were pictures of him in crisp martial arts uniforms, trophies held high, and others where he stood in front of audiences, smiling as though nothing in the world could shake him. To her, however, he was never the star, never the legend. He was simply her boy, her Chuck, and tonight she felt that same anticipation she had felt when he was younger, waiting for him to come through the door after practice, hungry and tired but proud of his progress. The clock above the stove ticked softly, its hands moving towards 7. She poured herself a cup of tea, the steam curling upward. Without realizing it, she had set out another cup across the table, filling it halfway. Old habits were carved deep. She always made room for him, even before he arrived. She looked at it with a small smile, shaking her head at her own predictability. But the smile faded when the sound came. 3 sharp knocks rattled the front door, quick, impatient. She paused, frowning. That was not how he knocked. He never knocked. He walked in with the ease of one who belonged, who knew the door was never locked for him. Her hand tightened on the dish towel as she moved toward the living room, the wooden floor creaking softly beneath her feet. The knocks came again, the same rhythm, authoritative. She stopped at the door, looking through the peephole. What she saw was not her son. A tall man stood on the porch, his shoulders wide beneath a black rain jacket that gleamed with wetness. His cap was pulled low, and his badge glinted in the porch light. The rain had left his face slick, but his expression was one that had nothing to do with courtesy. He looked like someone used to being obeyed without question. His nameplate, barely visible beneath the water droplets, read, Melin. She slid the chain across and opened the door just enough to speak. Yes, officer. Her voice was calm but touched with confusion. Evening, ma'am, he said, his tone flat, devoid of warmth. His eyes flicked past her shoulder, scanning the living room. We had a report of a disturbance at this address. Need to step inside and take a look. Her brow furrowed. A disturbance? That can't be right. It's only me here. Perhaps you've got the wrong house. Complaints are anonymous, Melin replied, shifting his weight forward. I still need to come in. She felt it then, the faintest ripple of unease sliding down her spine. The rain crackled outside, the thunder grumbling faintly in the distance. Something in his stance told her this was not about a complaint, but a lifetime of trusting the uniform, of believing it symbolized order and respect, warred against her instincts. She asked the question anyway, her voice steady though her heart quickened. "Do you have a warrant?" His jaw tightened, and his hand came to rest against the door frame, close enough for her to smell the damp nylon and stale coffee that clung to him. "Ma'am," he said, and now his voice had the edge of condescension, the tone of someone mistaking her civility for weakness. "I'm not here to argue legalities. I'm coming in." She should have shut the door. She thought it even as her hand moved, even as her sense of decency urged her to avoid confrontation. It was raining, and he was a police officer, and all her years told her uniform stood for something. So she slid the chain free and opened the door wider. "Fine," she said. "Wipe your feet." He didn't. He stepped inside as though he owned the house, his eyes crawling over the room. Photographs lined the mantel. Her son as a boy in his first year, her son laughing at a wedding with a woman in red, her son standing proud with a dog that had once been his constant companion. Emlin's lip curled as he looked at them, the kind of smirk men wore when faced with things they could never achieve themselves. "Quiet little neighborhood," he remarked. "Shame about the break-ins." "We don't have those on this block," she said firmly, shutting the door behind him. "Can I help you with something specific, or did you just want to drip on my rugs?" He turned toward her too quickly, and his face shifted subtly, something sharp and ugly flashing there, like a knife glinting in a pocket. "Watch your tone," he said. "Watch your boots," she answered before she could stop herself. Perhaps she was getting old enough not to care. Thunder rolled again, heavier this time, shaking the windows. The house seemed to listen, as though waiting for what would come next. The silence between them stretched, his eyes narrowed, his hand twitching near his belt, though not quite resting on anything. He seemed to enjoy the way her shoulders stiffened, the way her hand clutched at the towel. For a moment she thought of her son, of how easily he walked into any room, and how different it felt to have someone like this standing here, turning her home into a place of unease. There was no sign of Chuck yet, but she told herself he would come, that he would walk through the door as he always had. Still, the storm outside deepened, and with every second the presence of Officer Melin seemed heavier, more invasive. She had let him in out of respect, but now she realized he had entered not to help, not to protect, but to assert control. The tea on the table was growing cold. The extra cup she had poured for her son sat untouched, the steam long since faded into the air. And though she stood her ground, she felt the first true chill of fear stir within her chest. The knowledge that something had begun tonight that could not be undone. The rain outside had grown heavier, drumming against the windows and roof, as though the storm itself leaned closer to listen. Inside, the once warm and safe little house felt altered, charged with an air that was not its own. Mrs. Norris stood near the doorway, her hands still damp from the towel she had been carrying, her eyes following the officer as he walked further inside without permission. She had spent her whole life respecting authority, believing in the meaning of uniforms and badges. But something about this man's manner, the way he moved and looked around as though every object belonged to him, began to gnaw at her certainty. Melin did not so much as glance at her again as he stepped into the living room. His boots left wet marks on the floor, the water dripping from his coat onto the rug she had vacuumed just that morning. He paused at the mantel, studying the framed photographs there. His hand rose, gloved and careless, and he tilted one frame to the side so that the image of a much younger Chuck, standing tall in his first martial arts uniform, now sat crooked and askew. "So this is the famous Norris," Melin muttered under his breath with a curl of disdain. "Looks smaller in pictures." "That's my son," Mrs. Norris said firmly, her voice calm but edged with steel. "And you will put that frame back the way it was." He turned to look at her, his smirk widening, not the least bit ashamed. "He's not here now, is he?" Her jaw tightened. She knew she should not have to defend her son in her own home, certainly not to someone who had entered under the pretense of official duty. Yet the officer lingered, pulling another photo closer to his eyes. This one of Chuck at a family gathering, laughing with friends. Melin's chuckle was low, ugly, the sound of a man who recognized happiness and sought only to diminish it. "You keep these up like trophies," he sneered. "Like the walls are supposed to remind you you've done something worth remembering. But tell me, ma'am, what has he done for you lately? She took a step forward, her small frame unshaken. You don't belong here. I let you in because I thought you had reason, but I see now you don't. You've seen enough. Please leave my house. The words seemed to amuse him more than anger him. He strolled toward the kitchen, pulling open a drawer as he went, rummaging through utensils, tossing a wooden spoon aside carelessly onto the counter. He opened another drawer, then a cabinet, moving things with the air of someone searching for nothing at all, simply disrupting for the sake of it. Anonymous complaints, he said casually, glancing over his shoulder at her. You'd be surprised how often they point us to the right place. Drugs, weapons, people hiding things. He opened the pantry and trailed his fingers along the jars of flour, sugar, and tea. But sometimes it's just about keeping the peace. There is no disturbance here, she said, her voice sharper now. You are the only disturbance in my home. For the first time, he faced her fully, his dark eyes glinting with something that was not humor anymore, but cruelty. He stepped closer, and she could smell the sourness of his damp coat and the faint bitterness of old coffee. Watch that tone, he said, quieter this time, though the threat in it was sharper. Watch your manners, she shot back before she could stop herself. Perhaps age had given her courage, or perhaps it was simply outrage that pushed her to speak. His lips curled into that small, ugly smirk again, but it did not last. His hand shot out suddenly, shoving her shoulder back, as though to test how easily she might fall. She stumbled into the table, catching herself with one hand, her chest rising with both shock and indignation. She straightened quickly, refusing to cower, but before she could speak again, his arm came up and his fist struck her cheek with a crack that rang louder than the thunder outside. Her head snapped to the side, the sting of it sharp and immediate, her vision flashing white for a heartbeat. The dish towel fell from her grasp to the floor. The photographs rattled on the mantel. The teacups on the table trembled. And in that moment, the warmth of her home was shattered. She stood with one hand pressed to her cheek, her eyes wide, a storm of fury and disbelief surging inside her. He had not only invaded her house, he had struck her in it, struck her in the very space where she had raised her son, where every picture on the wall testified to the life they had built together. The humiliation was as deep as the pain. Melin lowered his hand slowly, as though the act had not been a loss of control but a deliberate choice. His expression was calm again, almost smug, as if daring her to protest. You were in my way, he said, his voice low. When I'm investigating, you don't get to decide what happens. You! Her voice shook with both fury and pain. You have no right. I have every right, he interrupted, stepping closer again. The badge gives me that, and you'd better remember it. The rain outside pounded harder, lightning flashing briefly through the window, illuminating the scene like a camera's cruel flash. Mrs. Norris stood trembling, not from weakness, but from rage she could barely contain. She thought of her son, of the strength he had shown throughout his life, and for a moment she wondered what he would do if he were here. The answer came not in words, but in the unmistakable sound of a key in the door, a familiar creak of hinges as it opened. A gust of cold, wet air swept in with it, carrying the scent of rain and the presence of someone who did not need introduction. The officer's head turned sharply toward the entryway, and Mrs. Norris's lips parted in relief. For there, stepping inside as though he had never been gone, was her son. The storm followed him inside. That was how it always felt when Chuck entered a room. The wind seemed to shift, the weight of the air thickened, and the balance of power was no longer a question of authority or uniforms, but of something older and far stronger. He stepped over the threshold, rain dripping from his coat, his boots heavy on the floorboards. He had his shoulders squared, his head held steady, and though he said nothing at first, the very sight of him standing there filled the little house with something that Officer Melin could not define but instinctively recognized as a challenge. Mrs. Norris's breath caught, not in surprise, she had expected him eventually, but in relief. Her hand still pressed against her cheek, the skin tender and burning where the officer's strike had landed. She looked at her son, and the years seemed to fold in on themselves. He was her boy again, the one who used to stand in the doorway after school, hair damp from the rain, eyes bright with defiance and pride. But now he was not a boy. He was the man everyone else knew by reputation, the one people whispered about with respect or fear, the one who carried his strength not like a weapon, but like a truth. Chuck's gaze swept the room once, and then it landed on her face. He saw the redness blooming across her cheek, the mark of the officer's hand, and though his expression remained calm, his eyes darkened with something colder than the storm outside. His jaw tightened slightly, his lips flattening, as if to hold back the words that wanted to come. He looked at the officer then, and the silence in the room became heavier than thunder. Melin adjusted his stance quickly, straightening as if to assert control. He had not expected this. He had entered the house thinking of himself as its master for the night, but now he faced a man whose presence was enough to unsettle him without a single word spoken. Still, his pride was not so easily shaken. His hand touched the edge of his belt, not gripping anything yet, but making clear the implication that authority rested there. "Evening," Melin said with a forced composure, his voice hard. "This doesn't concern you. Official police business." Chuck did not move from the doorway. He did not even blink. His eyes were steady, fixed on the man who had dared to raise a hand against his mother. When he spoke, his voice was calm even, but the tone was enough to slice through the officer's words like steel. "You struck my mother." Melin's lips twitched, the smirk from earlier threatening to return, but faltering under the weight of those words. "She interfered with an investigation." "There is no investigation here," Chuck said. His tone remained level, almost quiet, but it carried the unmistakable gravity of someone used to being obeyed. He stepped further into the room, removing his wet coat with one deliberate movement, laying it across the chair by the door. He moved with controlled ease, every motion purposeful, every step grounded. Mrs. Norris, still clutching her cheek, stood silently, watching. She knew what was coming, though even she did not know the shape it would take. She had seen her son fight before, in tournaments, on television, on film. But those were stages, arenas built for show. This was different. This was her living room, the place she had built with her own hands, the place where no one had the right to bring violence. Melin took a step forward, squaring his shoulders, his chin lifting. He was a big man, thick across the chest and arms, and in most rooms he would have been the presence that drew attention. But standing across from Chuck, his size seemed diminished. The difference was not in height or width, but in the way one man carried himself with arrogance, while the other carried himself with certainty. "You need to step aside," Melin said, his voice tightening now. "I'll search the house. After that, you and your mother can get back to your dinner." "You've searched enough," Chuck answered. His eyes did not leave the officer's, his tone not rising in volume, but gaining in weight. "Now you're going to walk out that door." The officer let out a laugh that was more bark than humor, a sound too sharp to be genuine. "You don't tell me what to do in my line of duty." "This is not your line of duty," Chuck said, stepping closer now. "This is my home, my mother's home, and you've crossed a line you can't uncross." The tension between them coiled tighter with every word, the room itself seeming to shrink as though the walls pressed closer to witness the confrontation. Outside, lightning split the sky, illuminating the window with a brief flash of white. The rain pounded against the glass, the rhythm quickening as though it kept pace with the rising heartbeat of the house. Melin's hand hovered nearer to his belt now, fingers brushing the handle of his baton. He did not draw it yet, but the threat was clear. His eyes flicked toward Mrs. Norris, then back to her son, and he seemed to weigh his options. There was pride in his stance, but beneath it, a flicker of unease had begun to creep in. Mrs. Norris spoke then, her voice steady despite the pain in her cheek. "Chuck." He turned his head slightly, just enough to meet her eyes. "Be careful," she said. It was not a warning against the officer, but a reminder of who he was, of the control that had always defined him. He gave her the smallest nod, then turned back to Melin. His eyes were unwavering, calm as the center of a storm. "You're going to regret raising your hand in this house." Melin finally pulled the baton free, the movement quick, the black stick gleaming faintly under the lamplight. He raised it, his stance wide, prepared to strike. For a split second, the balance of power seemed poised on the edge of that weapon. But Chuck did not flinch, did not step back. He simply shifted his weight forward, his muscles loose but ready, his eyes never leaving the man in front of him. The storm outside crashed again, thunder booming as though it heralded what was about to begin. And in that moment, Mrs. Norris knew the evening had changed forever. Her son had come home, and the intruder who had dared to violate her sanctuary was about to discover what it meant to stand against Chuck Norris. The storm's voice grew louder as if it were leaning in close to witness the moment. Rain hammered the roof and windows, thunder rolled across the sky, and every sound seemed to echo in the living room, amplifying the tension between the two men. Chuck stood loose but steady, his arms relaxed at his sides, his eyes never leaving Officer Emlin's face. Emlin, baton raised, shifted his weight with the impatience of a man who believed force was always the answer. The room had narrowed to just the two of them, predator and prey, though which was which had already been decided long before the baton left the officer's belt. Mrs. Norris stood to one side of the room, her back straight, her hand still pressed to the bruise on her cheek. She could feel her heart pounding, but not from fear. She had been frightened when Emlin first forced his way in, but that fear had ebbed the moment her son had walked through the door. Now there was only anger and something fiercer pride, the kind only a mother could feel when watching her child stand unyielding in defense of what was right. Melin let out a short breath, tightening his grip on the baton. "You think this is your house? Your rules," he said, his voice low, carrying the weight of arrogance. "But you're about to learn what happens when someone interferes with police business." "This isn't police business," Chuck replied, his voice calm, level, cutting through the air more sharply than the thunder outside. "This is trespass, assault, and now it's your last mistake." The officer's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into something between a sneer and a grimace. He stepped forward and swung the baton downward in a heavy arc meant to intimidate as much as injure. But Chuck was already moving before the strike had even begun its descent. His left hand shot upward, palm open, catching the officer's wrist mid-swing with a precision that froze the baton in midair. The impact made a dull thud, the kind of sound that was final, inevitable. Emlin's eyes widened, surprise flashing across his face as he tried to wrench his arm free. Chuck's grip tightened, his strength like steel. With a fluid movement, Chuck's right hand slid beneath the officer's elbow, lifting it skyward, twisting the joint with such exact control that Melin was forced onto his toes, the baton tumbling uselessly from his grip and clattering to the rug. "You don't raise your hand against a woman in my family," Chuck said, his voice soft but so sharp that it cut deeper than any shout. "Ever." The officer's face contorted, the pain in his arm written across every line. He tried to mask it with bravado, his teeth bared as he hissed, "You're the aggressor here. You'll pay for this." Chuck pivoted slightly, applying the smallest increase of pressure to the officer's elbow. The movement forced Emlin's body into an awkward shape, his balance stolen, his pride stripped away. "I'm not your aggressor," Chuck said evenly. "I'm your lesson." With one controlled motion, Chuck shifted his weight, guiding the officer downward. Emlin stumbled, his knees buckling as he collapsed face first onto the rug. The coffee table rattled from the impact, one of the frame photos tipping forward with the vibration, but Chuck had calculated the movement perfectly enough force to end the fight, but not enough to break the furniture or the man beneath him. He knelt, placing one knee firmly between Emlin's shoulder blades, his hands securing the officer's wrists with practiced precision. It was a hold born from years of martial arts, of teaching others control, discipline, and restraint. "Hands," Chuck commanded, though there was no need. The officer's wrists surrendered beneath his grip, his body pinned by the simple inevitability of superior skill. Mrs. Norris exhaled slowly, the ice pressed against her cheek dripping now as it melted, her eyes fixed on her son. She saw no anger in him, no recklessness, only control. He had not shouted, had not raged. He had simply moved like water turning to steel, protecting her with the quiet certainty she had always known lay at his core. "You all right, Ma?" Chuck asked, not taking his eyes from the man beneath him. She tightened her grip on the towel of ice, her voice firm though her cheek throbbed. "I will be. He hit me in my own house." I saw, Chuck replied. Melin squirmed beneath the pressure of Chuck's knee, his breath coming hard. You're under arrest, he muttered, though the words were weak, lacking conviction. No, Chuck said calmly, leaning down just enough that the officer could hear every syllable. You are. The words seemed to settle in the air like a verdict, heavier than the storm outside. Melin swallowed hard, his pride warring with the primal recognition that he was not in control, that he had never been in control from the moment Chuck had entered the room. His chest rose and fell quickly, the sound of his breathing loud against the silence of the house. The knock came then, sharp and insistent against the front door. A muffled voice followed, official, clipped by the rain. Officer Melin, status check. Junong. Chuck and his mother exchanged a look. The storm rattled the windows again, as if it too leaned forward to see how this new moment would unfold. More of them? She asked quietly. Probably, Chuck said, his eyes never leaving the man pinned beneath him. His grip tightened fractionally, reminding Melin how easily he could increase the pain if he wished. Answer him, Chuck instructed. The officer hesitated, his pride pushing against his fear. Chuck's voice dropped lower, his tone sharp as the blade of a knife. Be polite. For a moment, a war raged inside Melin's chest. His pride screamed to resist, to deny, but his body knew the truth of where he was and who held him there. At last, he lifted his head slightly, calling out through the rain. I'm fine. The lie hung in the air, wobbly, fragile, but it was enough to make the men outside hesitate. Mrs. Norris returned from the kitchen doorway, the towel of ice pressed against her cheek. Her eyes alight with something Chuck hadn't seen in years, a dangerous calm, the kind of fire that mothers carried when their children were threatened. Finish this, she said quietly, her voice tight but resolute. Another knock came, louder this time. Open up! Chuck rose in one smooth motion, releasing the officer's wrists, though leaving him sprawled on the rug, with a hand twisted awkwardly behind his back. Chuck picked up the fallen baton, weighing it for a moment in his hand before setting it carefully on the mantel, as though returning a book to its shelf. He turned toward the door, his expression unreadable, but his posture unmistakably ready. Stay, he told Melin, and though the word was simple, it carried the force of command that brooked no argument. He walked to the door, his steps unhurried, deliberate. The storm leaned close again, the rain slanting sideways, the wind howling as though it anticipated what was about to happen. Chuck placed his hand on the knob, rolling his shoulders once, the way a man might before prayer or before battle. Ma, he said softly over his shoulder, lock the kitchen door. What are you going to do? She asked, her voice calm but her eyes bright with the same dangerous fire he carried. He turned the knob slowly, his gaze forward, steady. Teach a class. And with that, he pulled the door open, letting the storm pour in, the rain splattering across the porch, soaking his shirt instantly. Two uniformed figures stood in the glow of the street lamp, blurred by weather but sharpened by intent. The storm roared as the first confrontation gave way to the next. The storm swallowed the doorway as Chuck pulled it open. Rain lashed sideways across the porch, splattering his shirt, soaking him instantly. The two figures standing outside were framed in the dim glow of the street lamp, their outlines blurred by the torrent. One was wiry, his eyes sharp and restless like a crow scanning for scraps of opportunity. The other was larger, thick through the jaw and neck, his presence the kind of brute force that leaned on intimidation more than skill. Both had their hands near their belts, their posture already tense, already speaking of confrontation. You're looking for Officer Melin, Chuck said, his voice carrying easily through the storm, though it was no louder than his normal tone. Calm, steady, but with an authority that made the rain itself seem quieter for a moment. The wiry officer squinted through the downpour, his gaze slipping past Chuck's shoulder into the house. That's right, he said. We got a status check call. He said he was fine, but... His eyes narrowed as he caught sight of Melin sprawled on the rug behind Chuck, groaning, his hand still clutching at his twisted shoulder. Doesn't look fine to me. Chuck stepped further out onto the porch, the door closing most of the way behind him. His stance was casual, his arms loose at his sides, but the sheer solidity of him radiated a pressure that made the air feel heavier. "You want him," Chuck said, his tone even. "You're going to hear the story first." The bigger officer sniffed, his nostrils flaring, his hand brushing against the holster at his hip in a gesture that was more habit than need. "Sir, step aside. We don't have time for—" Chuck's eyes cut to him like a blade, and the man stopped mid-sentence. "You've got time," Chuck said, "because what you're about to hear isn't a request." The wiry one hesitated, shifting on his feet, clearly unused to being interrupted, but Chuck continued before either could speak. "Melin came into my mother's house without a warrant. He pushed her, then he hit her." His voice did not rise, but each word landed like a stone dropped into water, sending ripples of truth outward. "That's assault. That's criminal. And if you think I'm letting him walk out of here without accounting for it, you've mistaken me for someone else." The wiry cop let out a short, awkward laugh, trying to undercut the weight of Chuck's words. But it died almost immediately when Chuck took a slow step forward, closing the space between them by an inch. Just enough to make both men instinctively shift their stance. It wasn't aggression, it was inevitability. "That's a serious accusation," the wiry one said finally, though his voice wavered. "It isn't an accusation," Chuck replied. "It's fact. You can see the mark on her face. You can see the man on the floor. And you're standing on the wrong porch on the wrong night if you think you're going to spin this another way." "Kikoni." The bigger officer bristled, squaring his shoulders as though sheer bulk might force the situation to his favor. "Sir, we're not here to debate." Chuck's hand rose, palm outward, stopping the man cold without even touching him. "You are here to debate," he said, "because you chose to walk into my mother's neighborhood and back up a man who hit a woman. That means you've got a choice to make. Right here, right now." The wiry cop swallowed hard, his eyes darting to his partner, then back to Chuck. The rain poured down harder, drumming against their caps, running down their jackets in rivulets. Thunder cracked somewhere above, and the porch light flickered as though the storm itself was on edge. "What if we don't?" the wiry one asked, though the question sounded more like a test than defiance. Chuck's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. "Then I treat you the same way I treated Melin when he thought a baton gave him the right to swing at me." The words landed like a blow. Both men stiffened, their weight shifting as though readying for a fight, but neither moved first. The bigger one took a deliberate step forward, his boots splashing in the puddles at the edge of the porch. "Let's cut the games," he said. "You're interfering with police work." That was enough. Chuck did not wait for the rest of the sentence. His hand shot out, catching the man's wrist before he even realized what was happening. A twist, smooth and precise, sent the officer stumbling sideways, his balance stolen in an instant. His other hand rose to grab Chuck's arm, but Chuck was already there, his free hand intercepting midair and folding it down with practiced control. The officer grunted, his knees buckling as Chuck hooked his foot behind the man's ankle and swept him to one knee on the porch boards. "Lesson 2, Chuck said, his voice low but carrying through the storm. "When you see wrong happening, you stop it. You don't back it up." The wiry cop cursed and lunged forward, baton raised high. Chuck rose just enough to meet him, his right forearm snapping upward in a perfect deflection, redirecting the swing with effortless timing. His other hand shot to the man's collar, pulling him forward and into the porch post with a dull thud that knocked the wind out of him. The baton clattered to the wet boards, rolling away into the rain. Both men staggered, stunned, not just by the physical blows, but by the sheer speed, the impossible precision of it. Chuck stood between them, calm, steady, his chest rising and falling with the ease of someone for whom this was not a fight, but a demonstration. The bigger officer scrambled to his feet, his breath heavy, his eyes wide now with the dawning realization that bulk meant nothing here. The wiry one bent double, gasping, his hands clutching at the post for balance. "Go check on your partner inside," Chuck said, jerking his chin toward the door. "See if he wants to walk out or crawl out." Neither moved. They hesitated, looking at one another, drenched and shaken. "That wasn't a suggestion," Chuck added, and his tone carried such finality that both men instinctively obeyed. They stepped past him into the living room, the bigger one helping the wiry one along. Inside, the air was warmer again, but no less tense. Melin sat slouched on the edge of the couch, his face pale, his eyes darting between Chuck and the door like a cornered rat searching for two exits at once. His hand rubbed his shoulder gingerly, the pain of Chuck's earlier hold still fresh. The bruise on his jaw from their brief clash was already darkening. "What happened, Em?" the bigger officer asked tightly, his voice threaded with disbelief. Melin muttered something about resistance, about hostile behavior, but the words rang hollow in the air, his broken pride written plainly across his face. The wary cop glanced at Chuck, then back at his colleague, and whatever doubt he had been clinging to finally cracked. He saw the truth. Chuck closed the door behind them, shutting out the storm. He didn't crowd the room, didn't need to. His presence filled it, anchored by the way his mother now stood in the kitchen doorway, her chin lifted, the bruise on her cheek framed by the towel of melting ice she pressed there. Her gaze was steady, proud, as though she were a queen watching her champion. "I'm letting you leave with him," Chuck said. His voice was calm, steady. "That's the only grace you're getting tonight, but you make sure this gets to your chief exactly the way it happened. Every word, every swing, every insult, every hit on an innocent woman, and you tell him Chuck Norris sent it." The wiry cop nodded quickly, swallowing hard. The bigger one moved to help Melin to his feet, half supporting, half dragging him toward the door. They said nothing more. They stepped back into the rain, the cruiser's headlights briefly illuminating the yard before fading into the mist as they drove away. The house grew quiet again, the only sound the ticking of the clock and the soft patter of water dripping from Chuck's clothes onto the floorboards. Mrs. Norris lowered the ice pack from her cheek, her eyes fixed on her son. He turned to her, his expression softening for the first time that night. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded slowly, the faintest smile touching her lips despite the bruise. "You didn't even get to eat yet." Chuck allowed a small smile of his own. "Dinner can wait," he said. "Respect doesn't." The storm outside rumbled again, but inside the battle was over for now. Yet both of them knew it wasn't the end. The men who had left would not forget, and neither would he. There were still lessons to be taught, and Chuck was not a man to leave a lesson unfinished. The silence that followed the cruiser's departure lingered in the house like a held breath. The storm still roared outside, its voice pressed against the windows and roof. But within those walls there was only the hum of the refrigerator, the slow drip of rainwater falling from Chuck's coat onto the rug, and the steady ticking of the clock on the stove. Mrs. Norris stood in the doorway to the kitchen, the damp towel of melting ice sliding from her cheek into her hand, and looked at her son. He was still near the door, shoulders squared, breathing measured, but his eyes carried the storm with him. He had not relaxed, not entirely. He never did, not when there was still unfinished business. "You didn't have to go that far," she said softly, though there was no reproach in her tone. She knew him too well. Chuck turned to face her, his voice quiet but certain. "Yes, I did. You've spent your whole life helping people. It's about time someone made sure you were treated with the same respect you've given." She set the towel aside, her cheek tender beneath her fingertips, and crossed the room to sit at the table. The extra cup of tea she had poured for him earlier sat cold and untouched, the faint steam long gone. She looked at it, then at him. "They won't let this go, you know. Men like that never do. They'll twist the story, make me the villain, make you the criminal." Chuck pulled out the chair across from her, lowering himself into it. His movements were controlled, unhurried, as though the weight of the evening demanded reverence. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, his gaze steady. "Then we make sure they can't lie about what happened. We make sure they never forget who they put their hands on." Her brow furrowed. "What are you going to do?" He leaned back slightly, his eyes fixed on the darkened window, where raindrops raced down in chaotic streams. His voice was deliberate, quiet, but edged with iron. "I'm going to finish the lesson." The knock at the door the following morning was softer than the pounding fists of the night before, but it carried with it a weight no less heavy. Morning light crept across the curtains, pale and uncertain, glinting off the framed photographs on the mantel. Mrs. Norris set her tea down and rose slowly, her body still stiff from the shock of yesterday, but her poise unshaken. Chuck was already standing near the window, arms folded, watching the cruiser pull into the drive. He had known they would come. Fear was a better motivator than pride, he had said, and he had been right. When he opened the door, Officer Melin stood there, looking nothing like the arrogant brute of the previous night. His uniform was wrinkled, his cap askew, his eyes bloodshot. Behind him, the wiry officer and the larger one hung back, their posture subdued, as though they wanted no part of what was about to happen. The storm had passed, but the memory of it had left its mark on all of them. "Come in," Chuck said, his tone leaving no room for refusal. Melin stepped inside, his eyes flicking around the house nervously, as though the walls themselves judged him. He shifted uncomfortably on his feet, the silence pressing down on him like a weight. Chuck closed the door behind them, the click of the lock final. He did not invite Melin to sit. He didn't need to. "You have something to say," Chuck prompted, his eyes never leaving the man's face. Melin swallowed hard and turned toward Mrs. Norris. "Ma'am, His voice cracked, and he had to start again. "I was wrong. I had no reason to hit you, no reason to enter your home the way I did. It was unprofessional. It was cruel. I'm sorry." Mrs. Norris stood still, her expression calm but cold, her eyes piercing him with a clarity that made him shift again, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Sorry doesn't undo what you did," she said evenly. "You struck me in my own house. You thought you could." Chuck stepped closer, his presence looming behind the officer like a shadow. "Tell her why you did it." Lynn hesitated, his jaw tightening, the words trapped behind pride. But Chuck's silence pressed them out of him, squeezing the truth into the open. "Because I thought I could," he admitted finally, his voice breaking. "Because I thought no one would stop me." "Exactly," Chuck said, his tone like iron. "You thought she was alone. You thought she was easy to break, and you learned you were wrong." "Yes, sir," Lynn said, his eyes fixed on the floor. The room stayed quiet for a long moment, the ticking of the clock on the stove the only sound. Then Chuck spoke again, his voice low but carrying the weight of judgment. "Now you're going to do something for me. Every week, for the next 3 months, you're going to come here unarmed and do whatever my mother asks. Yard work, fixing things, carrying groceries, whatever she says. Consider it penance." Belin's head snapped up, his eyes wide. That's mercy," he said, confusion and shame twisting in his expression. Chuck stepped closer still, his eyes locked on Emlin's. "Yes, it's mercy, because the alternative is me following you every time you put on that badge. And you don't want that." The wiry officer shifted uncomfortably behind him, muttering, "Do it, Emlyn." After a long pause, Emlyn nodded. "All right." Mrs. Norris said nothing, but she lifted her chin, her eyes still cold, her silence heavier than any command. Chuck leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a warning that cut deeper than any blow. "And if you ever lay a hand on someone out of arrogance again, uniform or not, I will find you, and we will finish the fight you were too scared to start last night." Melin swallowed hard, his face pale, and nodded again. "Understood." Chuck stepped back and opened the door, letting the cool morning air wash into the room. "Now get out. Be here Saturday at 8 sharp. The 3 officers filed out without another word, their boots heavy on the porch steps. The cruiser pulled away slowly, the engine quiet, as though even the machine itself knew the road beneath it had become dangerous. When the door closed again, Mrs. Norris looked at her son, her hand brushing the bruise on her cheek. "You didn't have to do all that," she said softly. "Yes, I did," Chuck replied, "because people like him think strength is about control, about fear. But real strength is about protection, about respect." She smiled faintly, shaking her head. "You've always been stubborn." He allowed himself a small grin. "And it's kept me alive." The morning light spilled brighter through the curtains, glinting off the frames on the mantel. Outside, the sky was clearing, the storm spent, but the memory of it lingered. For Officer Melin, the lesson was far from over. For Chuck, the message was simple. No one, cop or stranger, laid a hand on his family and walked away unchanged. And in that neighborhood, In that little house with its warm kitchen and stubborn rose bush by the porch, the story of that night would be told for years. Don't miss what's coming next. Hit subscribe now so you never skip the most shocking and unbelievable stories. Watch the next video right here for twists you won't see coming, and dive into our other videos packed with secrets and revelations you have to see to believe. And if this story stunned you, share it with your friends. Let them experience it too.